I knew the axe was about to swing the second the VP straightened his tie and looked around the conference room like he'd just walked into a Western saloon. But I didn't expect him to do it like this, public execution style. "You're not a cultural fit," he announced, standing at the head of the table, grinning like a cat that thinks it's cornered a mouse. 25 years, boiled down to 7 words. The room went so still I could hear the hum of the projector fan. A couple of people shifted in their seats, most just stared at the table, afraid that if they made eye contact with me they'd be next. I sat there for a second, letting the words hang in the air like the smell of burnt coffee. My cheeks burned, but my pulse slowed instead of spiking. He thought he'd humiliated me. Hell, maybe he thought this was going to be some kind of triumphant out with the old, in with the new moment for his little regime. But here's the thing, I knew something he didn't, and that knowledge sat in my chest like a loaded weapon. I stood up slowly, pushed my chair in, and gave him the kind of polite smile you give a stranger who's just cut you off in traffic. "Noted," I said. No theatrics, no scene. Just enough calm to make him blink. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Jenna from accounting biting her lip, looking like she wanted to say something but didn't dare. That's the thing about corporate America, fear is contagious. Before I go on, quick thing, 97% of you listening to stories like this aren't subscribed. I don't take roll call, but it sure keeps the team going when that number drops. Makes us feel like we're not just yelling into the void while the VP types up another memo about culture. Anyway, back to the firing squad. He kept talking, as if adding more words would make his decision seem more official. "We need people who align with the new vision," he said, pacing a little, avoiding specifics. It was all corporate foam, big, airy words with no substance. A vision he hadn't actually shared with anyone yet, unless you counted the 2 imports from his old company, who were already circling his orbit like moths to a street lamp. The thing about moments like these is they feel longer than they are. My mind started flipping through the Rolodex of years. Midnight phone calls from clients in trouble, last-minute filings that kept contracts from collapsing, that quiet nod from the founder after I'd saved a deal no one else even knew was slipping away. None of it was in my job description, but it was the spine of this place. And all of it, every handshake, every unwritten renewal, was in my head and my head alone. I didn't bother asking questions. He didn't have answers, and I didn't need them. Instead, I gathered my notepad, the pen I'd been using since before he was shaving, and stood there just long enough for the silence to turn heavy. I wanted him to feel it, that small shift in the air when the person you think you've just beaten walks away holding the real prize. The hallway felt longer than usual as I walked it, past walls lined with framed awards and photos from company parties. Half of them were events I'd organized, moments I'd held together when budgets were tight and morale was tighter. I passed by Dan from logistics, who gave me a quick, tight nod. No words, he didn't have to say them. He knew. When I reached my office, I closed the door and sat for a moment. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the late morning light into bars across my desk. I started packing, slow and deliberate, taking only what was mine. A mug from my first trade show. A framed picture of the old team. Half of them gone now, my favorite pen, the rest could stay. And in the top drawer, still locked, was a small black box, empty. It had been empty for years, but nobody knew that. It wasn't the box that mattered, it was the habit it represented. The trust it symbolized. The founder had once handed me documents so sensitive they'd never touched a hard drive, with instructions so clear they were etched into my memory. If these ever got misplaced, penalties alone could bury us. That was before the VP. That was before culture became an excuse for ignorance. I didn't touch the box. I didn't have to. I just left it where it was, knowing sooner or later, someone would open that drawer, see the lock, and realize they had no key, literally or otherwise. As I wheeled my small box of belongings to the elevator, I caught my reflection in the brushed metal doors. I didn't look like someone who'd just lost their job. I looked like someone who'd just been handed a countdown clock, and I knew exactly when it would hit zero. I didn't rush, that was the point. There's a certain satisfaction in moving at your own pace when someone's expecting you to scuttle out like a beaten dog. I went drawer by drawer, touching each item as if weighing its importance, and in my head I was ticking through another list entirely, the real list. Account names, investor contact numbers, renewal dates down to the hour, little handwritten notes from years back that reminded me which client preferred a phone call before a wire transfer, and which one would yank every cent if they smelled a change in procedure. These weren't things you could upload to a shared drive. They lived in the grooves of my memory. The awards along the hallway felt heavier today, like they knew I was the last person left who remembered the story behind each one. The Service Excellence plaque from 2004. That came after I stayed in the office 36 hours straight fixing a paperwork chain that would have cost us a 7-figure deal. The framed picture of the founder shaking my hand? That wasn't for show. He just trusted me with the first set of files that no one else was allowed to touch. In my desk, I stacked my personal files. Nothing critical, just my own notes and old printouts I like to keep. The small locked box stayed exactly where it was, tucked into the corner of the top drawer. Black, nondescript, the kind of thing that makes people curious. It had been empty for years, but the emptiness wasn't the point. It was a decoy and a reminder, a quiet monument to the fact that I was the only one who'd ever been given a key. Anyone who found it would waste time trying to get inside, thinking the real prize was in there. They'd be wrong. I left my keycard on the desk, neatly centered. No dramatic toss. No petty swipe across the VP's new laptop. That's the thing about real leverage, it works best when you don't flaunt it. You let it sit, quiet, until the moment the right person realizes they can't move forward without you. I loaded my box of belongings, light enough to carry in one arm, and headed toward the elevator. On the way, I passed by the glass-walled project room where the VP was holding court with his two loyal imports. He was leaning back in a chair that still had my settings saved, gesturing with the kind of confidence only ignorance can buy. I didn't stop walking, but I let my eyes flick toward him just long enough for him to notice. No glare, no smirk, just the kind of steady look that makes someone wonder if you know something they don't. Inside, I was already mapping out the next 48 hours. Without my weekly confirmations, certain filings would start aging out. No one would notice for a few days, maybe a week at most. Then the first notice would hit, probably from Mason Capital. They were sticklers about timing, and I had always been the one to make sure their renewals were handled quietly, outside the accounting system. The founder insisted on that, said it was relationship management, but I knew it was more than that. It was about trust that couldn't survive committee oversight. Stepping out into the lobby, the air felt different. Lighter? I wasn't leaving in shame. I was leaving like someone who'd just set a row of dominoes upright and walked away before giving them the push. I didn't need to make a call, didn't need to drop a hint. The system was already in motion. And the best part? They wouldn't even realize I'd been the linchpin until the screws were already rattling loose. The security guard at the front desk gave me a polite nod as I passed. Long day? He asked. I smiled. About to get longer for someone else. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside without looking back. My time here was over, but the shadow I'd leave behind was just beginning to stretch. The files, the calls, the schedules, they were invisible to everyone but me, and without me, they'd vanish just as easily as I had. By the next afternoon, word was already trickling back to me from people who still had a spine and a pulse inside that building. Apparently, the new VP had made the break room his stage, leaning against the counter like he was in some bad motivational poster, telling anyone within earshot that I'd been dead weight for years. Dead weight, right? Dead weight that had been the only bridge between the founder's handshake deals and the investor's ironclad expectations. He wasn't just patting himself on the back. He was laying out his grand plan to replace me with a more agile hire from his old stomping grounds. Translation: someone cheaper, someone loyal to him, someone who wouldn't ask awkward questions about why the man in charge still didn't know the difference between a trust account and a payroll account. The break room audience was polite, I heard, lots of tight smiles, nods that didn't reach the eyes. My friend in compliance, Maria, told me later that she wanted to ask him point blank if he even knew what the legacy files were. She didn't feel like being publicly humiliated before lunch. Instead, she just sipped her coffee and let him run his mouth, all while knowing that his ignorance was practically radioactive. And the beauty of it? The legacy files weren't even complicated if you knew what you were looking at. They were a network, part relationship history, part procedural landmine, that only functioned because one person, me, had all the pieces. It wasn't just names and numbers. It was the kind of granular, quirky knowledge that only comes from being in the room for 25 years, like which investor's assistant would only respond to phone calls before 9 a.m., or which renewal paperwork had to be hand-delivered because the client's lawyer hated FedEx. That wasn't in any training manual. Maria's voice lowered when she called me that night. He doesn't even know the files exist, she said, almost laughing. He thinks everything's in the main server. I actually had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing too hard. The main server. The graveyard of half-completed uploads and mislabeled PDFs. The last place in the world those files would be. He was like a guy bragging about cleaning out a bank vault without realizing the real treasure was buried in the foundation. And here's where it got better. In his rush to streamline operations, he'd apparently ordered a purge of redundant hard copy files. Which meant, in about 2 weeks, he'd be shredding binders that contained references and codes he'd need to even begin reconstructing what I'd been handling. Maria said one of the junior admins had already asked, are we sure we don't need these? And he'd waved her off with, if they were important, they'd be in the system. That sentence alone was going to cost him millions. He just didn't know it yet. I pictured him standing there in the break room, one hand on his coffee mug, talking about efficiency while his whole plan sat on a cliff edge with the ground eroding underneath. He probably thought he'd pulled off some masterstroke, cutting costs, proving himself decisive. But every word he spoke was another sign he didn't know what game he was actually playing. The trap didn't need setting. It was already there. He'd walked straight into it, smiling, with no idea that every step forward was one closer to the point where he'd be standing in a boardroom, pale and stammering, while the founder's eyes bored a hole through him. I didn't need to lift a finger. All I had to do was wait for gravity to do its job. It was a rainy Tuesday when the founder first handed me the responsibility that would change the way I saw my role forever. We weren't in some high-rise boardroom or a conference call with lawyers. We were in the back booth of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the office, a kind of place with cracked leather seats and mugs older than the interns. He slid into the seat across from me, a battered leather briefcase between us, and didn't even take his coat off before getting to the point. "This isn't going in the system," he said, voice low enough that I had to lean in. The smell of black coffee and rain-soaked wool clung to him. "And it's not going through accounting. It's for you, only you." He clicked open the briefcase and slid a folder toward me. Heavy cream-colored paper, edges crisp, the kind of thing you could tell cost more than it should just by the texture. Inside were investor agreements, handshake deals, but documented enough to exist if they needed to, and dangerous enough that if the wrong person saw them, it could cause trouble in 10 different directions. "If these ever get mishandled," he said, locking eyes with me, "the penalties could bury us." He didn't mean us as in the company. He meant him, his name, his reputation. I nodded, not because I fully grasped the weight of it yet, but because I understood enough to know this was a line you didn't cross. He'd built this company from a folding table in his garage to what it was now, and these agreements were the invisible skeleton holding up the whole structure. Some of the investors didn't want their involvement public. Some were tied to other ventures that would look like conflicts of interest on paper. Some just wanted the comfort of knowing that if they called me personally, I could tell them exactly where their money was, what it was earning, and when their next transfer would land, without it ever passing through the glare of internal bureaucracy. We met like that a few times a year after that, always somewhere off the company's radar. He'd bring updated paperwork, I'd bring a slim leather folder to return completed confirmations. No email chains, no shared drives, just a single physical set of documents in my custody, stored in a locked cabinet no one else had access to. He once told me he'd considered making it a two-person job but decided against it. "Too many hands," he'd said, "and something always falls through the cracks. One point of contact, one person I can trust." I can still remember the faint smirk he gave me when he said, "You ever notice how trust isn't about how much you like someone? It's about how much you're willing to gamble they won't screw you over." And then he took a sip of coffee like he'd just ordered a sandwich, not handed me the keys to a system that could implode the company overnight if mishandled. Over the years, the process became second nature. Investors knew my voice, knew that if I said a filing was complete or a renewal was in motion, they could take it to the bank, literally. There were no reminder emails, no automated alerts, no redundant checks. Just me, my calendar, and the memory of every meeting, every quirk, every date that mattered. It wasn't a burden, it was a point of pride. And that pride came with a quiet edge. Because I knew if those files went missing, or worse, if they landed in the wrong hands, the bury us line wasn't hyperbole. The penalties alone could gut our reserves, and the loss of confidence from investors would topple everything the founder had built. That's why the idea of some new VP, fresh off whatever mediocre conquest had earned him this role, thinking he could streamline me out of existence was almost funny. He had no idea that I wasn't just a cog in the machine, I was the lock on the vault. And the man who built the vault, he knew exactly what would happen if the lock disappeared. So when the day came that the founder would walk into that boardroom, furious and demanding to know where my files were, it wouldn't be about sentiment or loyalty. It would be about survival. And survival has a way of stripping away all the polite nonsense to reveal who really matters. The beauty of the whole thing was how invisible it was at first. Day one after I left, nothing looked different. The lights were still on, coffee machines still sputtering, the VP still strutting down hallways like a rooster in a yard he didn't build. But behind the glass walls and cheerful Slack messages, the clock had already started ticking. The first filing was due 3 days after my departure. It wasn't on any shared company calendar, and it wasn't in the accounting software. It was a private arrangement between the founder and one of our oldest investors, a quarterly confirmation that their funds were in the correct structure, supported by a specific notarized statement. That statement had to be physically sent, signed, and returned. No shortcuts. No digital signatures. The whole thing was archaic, but that's exactly why it worked, because the people who required it didn't trust anything newer than a fountain pen. Normally, I'd have handled it without a ripple. Draft the document, walk it down to the notary, courier it same day, and confirm delivery. But now, the VP didn't even know it existed. The reminder wasn't a calendar alert, it was the sound in my head of a clock chiming at 11 o'clock a.m. on the third Wednesday of the quarter. And that Wednesday came and went without so much as a glance in the right direction. By day 5, the final cursey period began. That wasn't written anywhere in company documentation, either. It was an unspoken grace window I'd negotiated years ago, one I could extend with a phone call to the investor's assistant. Without that call, the clock moved to stage 2, an automatic penalty fee. It was small at first, laughable even, less than the cost of the VP's new ergonomic chair. But the real danger wasn't the fee. It was the clause in the agreement that said 2 consecutive missed confirmations triggered an automatic right for the investor to withdraw all funds without notice. And when I say funds, I'm not talking about pocket change. I'm talking millions that had been quietly sitting in our accounts, cushioning every bad quarter and smoothing every delay. On day 7, another deadline passed. This one wasn't even financial on paper. It was a renewal of a compliance certificate for a trust account registered under an alternate holding name. No one in the company besides me and the founder even knew that name existed. Without the renewal, the account status would quietly downgrade, and any transactions through it would flag for review by an external auditor. That alone wouldn't kill them, but it would slow money movement to a crawl, and investors hate waiting for their money. The penalties were stacking now, like hairline cracks in a foundation no one's bothered to check. Inside that building, the VP was probably still telling his cost-cutting story to anyone who'd listen, unaware that every day he delayed learning what I really did was another day closer to an investor's lawyer sending a very expensive, very angry letter. I sat at home, coffee in hand, watching the rain streak down the window. My phone sat silent on the table. I didn't need to call anyone. I didn't need to stir the pot. The pot was already on the stove, flame set to low, heat building slow enough that the VP wouldn't even notice it was boiling until the steam hit him in the face. There's a certain calm satisfaction in knowing you've built something so integral that removing you doesn't cause an immediate explosion, it causes a delayed implosion. Quieter, more thorough, and a hell of a lot harder to stop once it starts. It started with a single sheet of paper that landed on the wrong desk. A mid-level manager, Patricia, sharp enough to smell trouble but too low on the food chain to get anyone to listen, found an envelope in her tray with a bright red stamp across the top. Final warning. Inside was a payment notice from one of our longest-standing investors. The tone wasn't angry yet, but it was clipped, formal, the kind of language that means the polite phase is officially over. Patricia, bless her, walked it straight into the CFO's office. She explained that she'd never seen anything like it and that it wasn't tied to any invoice in the accounting system. She even pointed out the unique account reference number in the corner, a number that wouldn't match anything in their files because it came from the founder's private investor agreements. Agreements only I had the map to. The CFO barely looked up from his screen. Accounting will sort it, he said, flicking his pen toward the door. Patricia hesitated, probably weighing whether it was worth pointing out that accounting wouldn't even know where to start. Then she left, letter still in hand, and filed it in her desk like a piece of evidence no one wanted to claim. By the time the paper hit her drawer, the clock had already rolled over into penalty territory. I could picture it in my head. The investor's internal process shifting gears, a lawyer somewhere preparing a withdrawal notice just in case this oversight wasn't fixed in time. That's the thing about people with money, they don't wait around to see if you'll get your act together. They act first and let you clean up the wreckage. That night, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Nate, one of the old guards still hanging on inside. Something feels off, were you handling this? No context. No attachment, he didn't need to explain. The way he phrased it told me everything I needed to know. Whatever this was, it was something so routine to me that its absence was now glaring. I typed back, which account? There was a long pause before his reply, one of the private ones. I don't even know the proper name. We got a weird notice from an investor and no one knows who to send it to. I didn't answer right away. I sat there in the soft glow of my living room lamp, sipping my coffee, letting the silence between texts stretch. I could almost hear the tension humming through the phone. Nate knew I'd handled it before. Hell, half the old-timers knew. But without me, it was like the trail had gone cold overnight. Another text from Nate popped up. I told them you probably had it covered before you know. I smirked. Before you decided I was dead weight, I thought, but didn't type. Instead, I just sent, yeah, I handled it. No follow-up. No instructions. I wanted him to feel the weight of that period at the end of the sentence. It said everything, I handled it. You didn't, and now you can't. I leaned back, the quiet of the room wrapping around me like a well-worn coat. It had begun. The edges were fraying, the cracks widening. They'd ignored the first hairline fractures because they didn't understand what they were looking at. But soon, someone who mattered, a lot more than Patricia or Nate, was going to notice. And when that happened, the VP's swagger would last about as long as a snowflake on a furnace. And I knew exactly who that someone was. The call came in just after 9 a.m. on a Thursday, and it didn't go through reception. One of our oldest investors had the founder's private number, a number so closely guarded it wasn't even in his assistant's Rolodex. The investor's voice, according to the assistant who overheard it, was ice-cold and clipped, the kind of tone that carries more weight than shouting ever could. No pleasantries, no warm-up, just straight into it. Where's my quarterly confirmation and why am I hearing nothing but silence from your people? The founder didn't respond right away. He listened. That's what he does when he's angry. He lets the other person unload, and when they're finished, he makes his move. This time, his move was to ask one question. You haven't received anything? Not even a courtesy call. The investor's answer was short, no. And if I don't have it by end of week, the terms change. That was all it took. The moment he hung up, the founder's assistant went into overdrive, scrambling to figure out what confirmation they were even talking about. She called the VP's office. No answer. She called his cell. He picked up and she relayed the message, urgency clear in her voice. Sounds like clerical noise, the VP said, barely paying attention. Probably an email stuck in spam. Tell them we're modernizing the process. No need for all the old paperwork. She froze. Sir, this is Mr. Delaney, she said, stressing the name like a warning flare. Anyone who'd been around longer than a year knew Delaney wasn't the type to misplace an email, and he didn't make idle threats. But the VP just chuckled. We're running a tighter ship now. I'll have someone circle back. That was it. No notes, no urgency. No understanding that he'd just put a torch to the single most delicate relationship the company had. The assistant, now pale and tight-lipped, went back to the founder's office and relayed the conversation. He didn't say a word. He just stood, reached for his coat, and told her to clear the rest of his week. What should I tell the board? She asked. Tell them I'll see them in person, he said. That last sentence was the real tell. The founder hasn't flown in years. Not for board meetings, not for investor summits, not even for crisis negotiations. If you wanted him, you came to him. The last time he booked a flight, the company was in the middle of a seven-figure lawsuit, and he came back with a signed settlement that stopped the bleeding overnight. By noon, he had a ticket in hand and a private agenda in his pocket. Not an email, not a Zoom call. He was going to look the VP, the CFO, and every smug face at that table in the eye. Somewhere inside the building, the VP was probably still feeling good about his streamlining project, leaning back in his chair while the foundations shifted under his feet. But I knew better. I could see it in my head, the founder walking into that boardroom, scanning the faces, and opening with the one question that would turn the air to ice. The end game wasn't just coming. It was boarding a plane. Boardroom smelled like catered pastries and overconfidence. The VP was mid-slide, pointing to some chart that showed a neat little upward arrow, projected savings from his streamlined leadership plan. He was in his element, chin high, voice smooth, basking in the polite nods from a few board members who didn't know enough to question the numbers. And with the redundancies eliminated, we can expect a 25% reduction in overhead by Q3, he was saying, clicking to another slide full of buzzwords and pastel-colored flowcharts. The double doors slammed open. Not pushed, slammed. Conversation stopped mid-breath. The founder strode in without breaking stride, trench coat still on, eyes fixed on the far end of the table where the CFO sat flipping through his copy of the meeting packet. Where are her files? That was it, no greeting, no build-up, just 6 words, sharp enough to slice the air. The VP blinked, mouth slightly open, as if trying to decide whether her meant me or some other unfortunate casualty of his reorganization spree. The CFO's reaction made it clear. His face went pale in an instant, like someone had just yanked the drain on all his blood. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Which files? He finally managed, voice barely above a whisper. The founder's tone didn't change. The ones she kept. Investor confirmations, renewal schedules, hand-delivered agreements. Where are they? The CFO glanced around the table like a man looking for an escape route that didn't exist. I thought those were in accounting. The founder didn't even turn his head toward the VP, but the weight of his silence landed squarely on him. You could almost hear the mental gears of the room grinding to a halt as the realization started to bloom. Whatever these files were, they mattered. A lot. And nobody in the room, except the man asking, knew where they were. VP tried to recover, his smile just a shade too quick. I'm sure we can pull whatever's needed from our central system. They're not in your system, the founder cut in, voice low and final. They were never in your system. The CFO was sweating now, eyes darting from the founder to the VP. We didn't know there were physical copies. The founder took a single step forward, leaning just slightly over the table. Then you didn't know your own business. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Chairs creaked. One of the board members cleared his throat, then thought better of speaking. The VP shifted in his seat, suddenly more interested in the condensation sliding down his water glass than in his upward arrow slide. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. I could see it play out in my mind like I'd scripted the scene myself. The founder's entrance, the question that cracked the polished facade. The CFO realizing too late that the VP had cut out the one person who could answer it. My absence was speaking louder than any revenge speech I could have given. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to send a single told you so. The silence filling that boardroom was doing it for me. And this was only the spark. The fallout hadn't even started yet. The founder didn't waste time explaining why he'd flown in. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and set it in the middle of the table like a dealer laying down a trump card. This, he said, tapping the page, is the agreement Delaney signed 20 years ago. It requires quarterly confirmations, notarized and hand-delivered for as long as his funds remain here. Miss 1, you pay a penalty. Miss 2, he can withdraw every cent without notice. No negotiation. No grace period. The CFO leaned forward to read it. Eyes widening. We've already missed 2? 3, the founder said flatly. The words landed like a hammer. The VP shifted in his chair, lips parting, but before he could speak, the founder kept going. And Delaney isn't the only one. We've missed filings with 3 other private investors, each with similar clauses. As of 30 minutes ago, every one of them has exercised their right to withdraw. That's $22 million gone. Instantly. And the contracts tied to that capital? He let the pause stretch. Nullified, you could hear the air leave the room. A few board members sat back hard in their chairs. Someone's pen rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. The VP finally found his voice. I wasn't aware these agreements even existed. If someone had told me, the founder's eyes snapped to him, sharp enough to cut glass. You fired the only person who could have told you. On day 2, VP opened his mouth again, but the founder's hand went up, palm out. Get out. No raised voice. No profanity. Just 2 words delivered like a closing door. The VP glanced around the table, searching for an ally. None of the board members met his gaze. He stood, movements jerky, and made for the door. No one stopped him. No one thanked him. By the time the latch clicked shut behind him, he was already a ghost. The founder looked back at the table, scanning each face until the silence was thick enough to choke on. Find her, he said. Today, that was it. No discussion of next steps, no attempt to sugarcoat the urgency. He didn't have to. They all knew the truth now. The company's survival hinged on the one person they'd pushed out, the one they'd dismissed as dead weight. Somewhere across town, I was sitting in my kitchen, sipping coffee, watching the late afternoon sun crawl across the counter. My phone was silent, for now, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. In the space of a single meeting, the VP's empire had crumbled, millions had walked out the door, and the same people who'd watched me leave without a word were now scrambling to figure out how to bring me back. Justice, delivered without me lifting a finger. And it was only just beginning. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.